and it's a pleasure to meet you all on our symposium about cosmopolitanism in urban spaces, the case of Odessa. This meeting has been organized by the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies from Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the program of Jewish Russian literature in the Department of Literature of Jewish People at Bar-Ilan University. And this is the great opportunity for me to see all of you and to meet you here. And it's a real pleasure to see old friends and new friends. And it's a great pleasure to host all of you here in this Zoom meeting, although we are in the complicated situation. All right, so again, thank you so much for being here. And we'll start this very important meeting about one of the greatest cities in the world, and especially in Jewish world, Odessa. Thank you to Efraim and Mirja for the group that they are managing this year in Institute for Advanced Studies, and for joining us with this meeting in this symposium. All right, so this event is going by two parts, and we'll make a little break, okay, in the middle of it. Let's decide where we take questions after every presentation or at the end of 3 presentations. I propose that it will be after every presentation, because the presentation is also the video presentation, sometimes some text that is presented here by the share screen. So I suggest that after every lecture, after every presentation, we'll take a few questions and proceed. All right? Okay, so let's start. And the first speaker today is Professor Efraim Sicher from Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. Efraim Sicher is a professor of comparative literature at Ben-Gurion University. He has published widely on modern Jewish culture, and particularly on Isaac Babel. At present, he is a research fellow at the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies, where he is the co-organizer with Professor Dr. Mirja Lecke of a research group on Odessa Cosmopolitanism. And obviously, Efraim is one of the organizers of this meeting today. Efraim, please, we're all hearing to you. We're listening to you.
Okay, but before I can begin, Roman, you have to allow me to share the screen, or you can put my presentation up on your screen.
You can share.
I can now share?
You can share your presentation. Yeah.
Okay, now I can. Right, thank you. There we go. And let's see. Slideshow. Yes. Okay, can everyone see the screen? Okay. Not quite, almost. So thank you very much, Roman, for the initiative. We planned this meeting a very long time ago, before the world was turned upside down by Corona. And we decided that we're not going to let anything get in our way, not even a world pandemic, or landing from Mars, or any other emergency. So thank you very much, Roman, for seeing this through and organizing it all in these very difficult times. My talk is called Time and Space in Odessa. I'm going to talk, I hope not too long, just very generally about some of the issues that we've been dealing with in our research group and that have concerned me in my own work on Odessa just going to close the window. Oh, excuse me. That's better. Okay. Founded in 1794 to spearhead the Russian Empire's colonization of Novorossiya, Odessa was open to French, Italian, and Levantine influences from its beginning. As a frontier town, Odessa attracted enterprise, a brand new city relatively free of traditions and taxation, certainly freer politically than other provincial Russian cities. As Russia's major port of grain export, Odessa attracted many foreigners, not just Galician Jews who came in the 1820s. It was a town of newcomers, a community of strangers, but also of ethnic groups affiliated to trading ports across Europe and the Mediterranean. This is one reason why Greek national movements flourished, and why later in the century, when Jews gained predominance in the grain trade, Odessa became a major center of modern Jewish culture and Zionism. Odessa was stamped with the imprint of European civilization, yet urban planning and efficient administration fell behind Enlightenment ideals of progress. The image of an El Dorado was not infrequently at odds with reality. Ethnic tensions surfaced in pogroms and labor unrest. However, as Caroline Humphrey has shown, diverse forms of sporadic and historically specific cosmopolitanism played out in the same space as inter-ethnic violence. For example, in 1905 in Deribas Street, Deribovska, where simultaneously cosmopolitanism operated amid the display of conspicuous consumption, modern time, and xenophobic reactions to reform, archaic time. Cosmopolitanism did not necessarily mean harmonic synergy between Jews and other ethnic groups. Its conditions changed by the end of the 19th century, while after 1905, a certain degree of immunity to pogroms in Odessa prevailed, partly owing to the complex dynamics of multi-ethnic coexistence and resistance to anarchy in the society and economy that was in the process of modernization. As Stephen Zipperstein has argued in his groundbreaking cultural history of Odessa Jewry of the Haskalah period, Odessa was unique because its Jewish community and cultural institutions were modern and secular, well before other major centers of Jewish culture in Eastern Europe. As a cosmopolitan Russian-speaking city on the shores of the Black Sea, it served as a transit and exchange point between Russia and the Mediterranean. Odessa, therefore, attracted Jewish brokers and merchants from Volhynia, Podolia, and especially from Brody in Galicia, who founded educational and communal institutions following the principles of the Haskalah with little opposition from traditional Jewish bodies. Odessa's leading figures in Jewish politics, such as Moshe Leib Lillenblum, were able to create a Jewish cultural center that could compete with Jewish communities in Petersburg, Vilna, and Kiev. Odessa's Jewish community developed from the 1860s a trilingual, secular, modern Jewish culture in Hebrew, Yiddish, and Russian. However, the history of Odessa's Jewish intellectuals was not uniform, but offered alternate models of Jewish identity. Jewish intellectuals participated, for example, in a variety of voluntary or communal organizations with various aims and agendas, such as the Mirja Club, founded in 1863. Some had political leanings, such as the Palestine Committee, a philanthropic organization for helping agricultural settlers and artisans in the land of Israel, established in 1890, and the only legal Zionist organization in Russia at the time. The Mutual Aid Society of Jewish Shop Clerks was, to take another example, an ethnocentric organization that evolved from a religious association into a political union, which was transformed by class solidarity into revolutionary activism. While ethnic identification was strong among Zionists and followers of Jewish socialist parties, revolutionary movements appealed to ideological commitment across ethnic divisions. Assimilated Jews in the Odessa branch of the Society for the Promotion of the Enlightenment saw themselves consolidating Russian national cultural identity. So these are just some examples of the wide range of possible Jewish cultural identities in Odessa. But increasingly, towards the 19th century, end of the 19th century, as we'll see, are becoming more assimilated and Russian-speaking. Odessa is a symbolic cradle of its revival of modern Hebrew literature, a liminal cultural space between Russia and the land of Israel. The wise men of Odessa, you see here, among them Bialik, Mendele, Balakirsky, Klausner, Lillenblum, Ben-Ami, Elchanan Levitsky, Ben-Gurion, Hadam, historian Simon Dubnov, the journalist Menachem Margulis, the Hebrew maskil Peretz Smolensky, the critic Alexander Zinzenbaum, and briefly in 1891 to 93, Sholom Aleichem, were synonymous with Odessa as a center of Jewish culture and nationalism. The author of Auto-Emancipation, Leah Penska, died in Odessa in 1891. For a while, they were joined by the Hebrew poet Shaul Chernyakhovsky and by the Russian Jewish poet Simon Freud. They formed a spiritual center of secular, enlightened, but not like-minded friends who met at Dubnov's or Mendel's. They lived within walking distance of each other, but could not ignore the distance between them in the Kulturkampf they waged from the 1890s into the early 20th century. The Hebrew writer Yitzhak Dov Berkovitz describes the wise men of Odessa living, as it were, on some enchanted island, quote, strolling among the frivolous, fun-loving Odessans, end quote, whom they viewed as, quote, hospitable yet spiritually remote natives, end quote. They were nevertheless not totally estranged from the wealthy, assimilated Jewish community, despite their predominant concern with business and money. Several wealthy Jewish magnates offered their support and patronage to Hebrew writers, some of whom were employed by local Jewish schools and organizations such as Forward Zion, Mendele headed Odessa's Reformed Talmud Torah, and so forth. These writers were, to a great extent, immersed in a Jewish tradition, but their Russian was sprinkled with quotations from Tolstoy and Pessoa, as well as progressive Western thinkers such as Darwin and Spencer. Situated on the fringe of Odessa Jewry, they held a tenuous position that was removed from the shtetl, but surrounded by a repressive regime and an anti-Semitic town council. Perhaps it is precisely because of their isolation from the rest of the Jewish community, as well as the exacting standards of the initiators of the Hebrew-speaking clubs, that the Hebrew writers who formed a literary center in Odessa from the 1880s felt they were achieving something new, the creation of a modern Hebrew language. Though it had antecedents in the 18th century, neo-midrashic language of East European masculine, the Nusach Odessa, the Odessa style, first appeared in Mendele's Hebrew writings. Its proponents demanded continuity with the past, clarity of thought, a sense of historical meaning, and a focus on the collective in the spirit of Hadam's cultural Zionism. As for Yiddish, Mordechai Ben-Ami reports that Mendele once said that he turned from Hebrew to Yiddish because modern Hebrew literature was too imbued with Russian literary influence, and Odessa Jews were ignorant of basic Jewish texts, only reading Gogol and Turgenev, whom they barely understood. Yiddish, moreover, not being a sacred tongue, lent itself to the everyday and profane. Mendele's Fischke der Kurmer, Fischke the Lame of 1869, shows the eponymous naive Städtelbäcker visiting Odessa and mocking the Gentile dress and manners of its Jews. They cannot spare a penny for a book peddler. He also makes fun of the hurdy-gurdy of the organ in the Brody synagogue, which accompanied the choir. Odessa's reputation became proverbial, both as a hotbed of secular enlightenment, Haskalah, and a heaven where fortunes might be made. They said in Yiddish, 10 miles around Odessa burn the fires of hell, but also to live like God in Odessa. It was economic opportunity that attracted Jews in the first place and made them patrons of a local opera house. They performed Jewish ritual as mere duty. The question remains, how Jewish was Odessa? In the 1890s, Russians, as in other parts of the empire, made up the land-owning and administrative classes, and Jews dominated the middle class and lower classes. Only a small fraction of the population were Ukrainians at this time, mostly male laborers, of whom less than 2/3 declared their mother tongue was Ukrainian. But over a third of Odessa's population were Yiddish speakers. However, by the end of the 19th century, Russian-speaking Jews had integrated into Odessa's liberal press and intellectual, social, and political life. At the end of the 19th century, Jews were able to participate freely in Odessa's hybrid cosmopolitan culture, except when excluded by discriminatory laws. They did not have to make allowances for their ethnic identity. Returning to Odessa in 1901, Jabotinsky launched his career as a feuilletonist in the Odessa University, the Odessa News, with a thoroughly acculturated cosmopolitan persona that combined the aspirations of Odessa's wealthier Jews for an accentless cultural status, and a worldly knowledge of European manners. In his autobiography, Story of My Life, Jabotinsky presents Odessa as a cosmopolitan city, which was characteristically neither Russian nor Jewish, but multi-ethnic. Jabotinsky's class at school, for example, comprised 11 different ethnic minorities, and out of 30 pupils, 10 were Jewish. The result was that the Jews who had worked hard to overcome discrimination in order to earn their place in the gymnasia and aspired to enter higher education, blended in with the rest without showing any tendency towards Zionist or other nationalist affiliations, though some pupils had a malamed, a private tutor, to teach them Hebrew at home, at their father's insistence, a phrase that Barber also uses in his autobiography. Jabotinsky contends that, with the possible exception of the Poles, all the boys shared the same cultural tastes, and it did not occur to Jabotinsky's peers that their ethnic difference was at all relevant to their cultural identity. Nevertheless, during the 1890s, the Jews felt a profound sense of cohesion as a separate social group, fraternized like other ethnic minorities among themselves, and were proud of their ethnicity as something natural, not deriving from ideological or religious consciousness. That, of course, is Jabotinsky's retrospective view in his autobiography. In his, the generational shift towards Russification was thus complicated, at least in this description of it, by the unique possibilities allowed by Odessa's transnational cultural spaces, where Jewishness was no cause for stigma or segregation. In his memory of boyhood and adolescence, Jabotinsky remembers Odessa for its carefree ways, so different from the strict discipline of the Cheder. Jabotinsky, like Bible after him, fondly recalls days spent on the beach when he should have been in school, not to mention evenings with a young Russian lady in Alexandra Park. Odessa's cultural spaces may be perceived differently by Odessa's various ethnic minorities and by different social classes. Yiddish and Hebrew cultural production remained separate from Russian-speaking Odessa and produced a distinctly separate myth from the Russian Odessa narrative already familiar by the 1890s. Moreover, there were different cultural spaces that functioned within Odessa's multi-ethnic cosmopolitan society. Take, for example, the Opera House, which we see here, patronized by a wide range of Odessa's population, including many who had no musical education. Mendelssohn, Bialik, and Robnitzky met in closed literary salons or Hebrew-speaking clubs, but they also frequented the Opera House, where the famous diva Isa Kremer performed. Mendelssohn tried to persuade her to sing in Yiddish, or encouraged her to sing in Yiddish and become the voice of her people. Jabotinsky has his own seat reserved for Mr. Atalena, but once he got into trouble with a police chief who thought the place of an eccentrically dressed dandy like him was in the gallery with the students and the other riffraff. It was in the Opera House that Jabotinsky staged his meeting in his autobiography, Story of My Life, with Schwarzman, a fellow Odessite who also loved Italy and who influenced Jabotinsky's path to Zionism. This example demonstrates that cosmopolitanism and nationalism were not necessarily in opposition. One of the most famous social meeting places, Van Corne's Cafe, never was a bohemian literary cafe of writers and intellectuals, though it was frequented by Efraim and visited by such luminaries of Russian literature as Bunin, Chekhov, and Gumyov, as well as by the legendary Odessa aviator Sergei Utorsky, who was widely regarded as an eccentric adventurer. Elsewhere, literary cafes were the milieu for Central and East European intellectuals who created, to use Shachar Pinsker's post-colonial terminology, a liminal or third space between the private and the public. the commercial and the cultural. The wise men of Odessa were repelled by the materialistic and fun-loving popular culture of Odessa's cafes, and particularly the Café Chantant, which were replacing lending libraries and book culture. Fanconi was where businessmen and journalists conversed by day and were entertained at night. Fanconi was somewhat less exclusive than Café Robinat across the street. There, as Caroline Humphrey remarks, cosmopolitanism was reformed as a public civic behavior that spoke to a world of Mediterranean and global commerce. They displayed a flamboyant dress code that often masked very different social origins. Fanconi's was not without tensions. When Monsieur Fanconi threw out a poor maskil who could not pay the bill, Balakirsky reported in Hamaelitz, the Jewish clientele threatened a boycott. Sholom Aleichem's Menachem Menendo, who we will shortly meet again in Dr. Natkovich's talk, tries unsuccessfully to explain in his letters to his long-suffering wife, Shena Shendor, how he buys time in Fanconi by ordering more ice cream in order to make his business deals on the London Stock Exchange until he loses all his money. In his fictional memoir, The Five, Yatra, Jabotinsky recalls Fanconi and Robinat as unofficial stock exchanges overflowing with sea of businessmen, a place where one could be seen as well as to talk about international affairs, far more interesting than the literary discussions of the intellectuals. In Eliezer Steinman's Hebrew novel, Esther Hayut, Fanconi's doors open to a world of gaiety and freedom from the prison of Esther's marriage. But they also reveal a mirror house of sham social hierarchies from which the provincial Esther can only dream of escaping by embodying the new woman. In Barber's 1927 film, Mirja Krieg, Benya sits in Fanconi's a bourgeois space identified with Kerensky's provisional government in 1917. A display of invalid veterans who are victims of the imperialist war moves the king of the gangsters to nominal compassion for the soldiers. But the real hero of the film is the Russian baker, Sapkov, a Gorkian hero who struggles for proletarian victory in the revolution. By the time the film was released, Fanconi's had been converted into a club for sailors of the Soviet Navy. As we will hear later on, in Ilf and Petrov's Little Golden Calf, the ruined brokers and other former patrons of Cafe Florida, now Cafe number 68, whom the Bolsheviks had put out of business, discuss international affairs as if they were still dealing in futures. They dream of Odessa being declared once again a Porto Franco in a utopian pan-European union. The private traders, like other crooks and conmen, are antediluvian relics in the Soviet period. It is not clear how Comrade Ostap Bendev will adjust to conditions of the Soviet future, the communist future, with little hope to become more than a janitor. Conclusion. A transnational multi-ethnic space in the period 1890 to 1921 enabled a burgeoning cosmopolitan modernism to develop in Odessa's copious periodical press of the pre-revolutionary years, where we find numerous names of poets, satirists, and artists, some of whom were lost to early death, immigration, or oblivion, while others are well known to us from their fame in Soviet Russia in the 20s, after moving to Moscow or Leningrad and forgetting or obscuring their pre-revolutionary bourgeois past. Rarely is attention paid to Yiddish or Hebrew despite the many Yiddish publications and satirical periodicals in the early 20th century, and the prolific output of Hebrew and Yiddish authors on the stage and in print. With the Bolshevik re-establishment of power in 1920, cosmopolitanism came to an end, together with Odessa's bourgeois and hedonistic lifestyle. 70 years of communist repression erased the memory of Odessa's vibrant pre-revolutionary past, now remembered, if at all, through the mist of a tertiary post-memory in the Odessa myth. The aim of our research group is to uncover the cultural archaeology of that past and to investigate the historical truth about Odessa cosmopolitanism. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Efraim. Yeah, Klaus muted. So now we'll take a few questions. So please, if someone has something to ask, this is the time.
May I please?
Yeah,
Efraim,
just please introduce yourself.
I'm sorry for coming late to that meeting. My name is Alexis. I have written a short piece about Odessa as a place for Jewish sociability around 1900. I'm an historian of Eastern Europe and Russia as a multi-ethnic empire. My question is very short. Efraim, could you give us the name of the one woman on the picture of the wise men of Odessa, which you showed to us?
I'm not sure. Not on the spot. I should explain to everyone that Alex is Hofmeister from Bar-Ilan University is part of our research group.
I'm sorry.
Yes, so thanks for the question. I think I'll have to investigate that and give you an answer after the symposium. I'm sorry.
Okay.
All right. Other questions? Mirja, please.
Yes, thank you. We've been talking about this many times, but still, I wonder about the interconnection between ethnic and cultural identity and certain urban spaces. The ones that you described to us very convincingly as places of encounters across ethnic lines, they all have some kind of social exclusiveness to them. The opera, the coffee houses, these are all places that exclude certain people by means of economic pressure or conventions or just habitus. Do you think that we can always tie cosmopolitan interaction to social classes, or do you think that this is something that happens in different ways in different places, that, for example, the port would also be a place of cosmopolitan interaction? Thank you, Efraim.
Yes, thank you very much. I think that's a very good point. And as I tried to hint in my very short presentation, we are talking about cosmopolitanism in a very specific class setting. I'm not sure whether the kind of port laborers that you mentioned, or say the carters in Odessa, stories by Bible, would have very much in common with the likes of Jabotinsky and the wise men of Odessa. I think it's very complicated. I think that it's definitely a class stratification which changes, especially after 1905. I think one reason why Odessa cosmopolitanism has been forgotten or repressed is because it was part of a bourgeois lifestyle that was no longer possible after the Bolshevik return in 1921. Even before then, the First World War had seen a whole flood of impoverished Jewish refugees from the Eastern Front, and the economy had taken a downturn made worse by the blockade and the famine. So yes, I think we need to look at the class divisions and see how much, if at all, people could cross those class lines, apart from just walking across the road or walking into the opera, and anyone could buy a ticket to the opera if they could afford it. So money and social status, and I would say also the ethnic position within the community are all factors that have to be taken into consideration together. It's not a simple picture at all. And cosmopolitanism in the Odessa port might actually mean something very different.
Thank you.
Thank you, Efraim. And we go on, all right? And so our next speaker is Professor Mirja Balakirsky Katz. She's an art historian in Bar-Ilan University at the Department of Jewish Art and clinical psychoanalyst. She is the author of The Visual Culture of Chabad and the other book, Drawing the Iron Curtain, Jews and the Golden Age of Soviet Animation, and another book, Intersections Between Jews and Media. And now the subject of your presentation is Freud in Odessa, defending Russian fairy tales with Jewish science. Mirja, please.
Thank you, Roman, and thank you, Efraim, for that great talk. So I wasn't part of the working group, and I'm learning how you're using cosmopolitanism. This is a very interesting question, and is the focus of my interest in the medical scene in Odessa, which, while acknowledged, Odessa is acknowledged as a cosmopolitan city, as we just heard from Efraim, in humanistic and commercial endeavors. Actually, it was considered a relatively provincial setting for medical science. And I know I'm not using the term cosmopolitanism the way that you just used it, but I'll get there. On the one hand, because of its commercial dependence on its port and its susceptibility to epidemics coming in from the port, Odessa actually boasted an active administrative and a clinical presence. Many foreigners arrived specifically for Odessa's picturesque nervous clinics, sanatoria, and private hospitals designed in impressive continental styles. I could share one or two images of these beautiful sanatorium, that I just got from postcards and all of that. But we see, and I'll just stop share. And the city was well equipped with low-paid clinical doctors and medical administrators in state service posts. On the other hand, Odessa lagged behind other Russian cities in the medical sciences. Odessa graduated many university students in medicine, but did not establish a post-secondary medical faculty until 1900. So actually, just to a little bit respond to Mirja, that the medical degree, the first degree, was a way for Jews to move, or not just Jews, for people in Odessa to move up in social rank. But if they wanted to get an advanced degree of Doctor of Medicine, they could not do so in Odessa. So when it came to the medical sciences, Odessa often relied on research either developed in other departments like zoology or reflexology, or imported from elsewhere. Likewise, whatever research actually was conducted in Odessa in the medical sciences, it was all too often exported to other cities for publication. Jews were well represented among the city's physician class, making up around 50% of the membership in the city's Society of Odessa Doctors at the turn of the 20th century. Yet we know relatively little about the experience of Odessa's Jewish physicians, because general medical histories all too often dismiss Odessa for its underdeveloped research infrastructure, and academic interest in Jewish doctors has largely focused on their contribution to Jewish causes rather than medical science, as in the case of Leo Pinsker, Emanuel Soloveitchik, and Nathan Bernstein. Yet the scenario I just briefly described created the conditions for the rise of Odessa's Jewish pioneers of psychoanalysis, or what late in period called the new science of the soul, and the early Soviet period called Freudianism. That is, because Odessa's academic training could not compete with St. Petersburg, Moscow, Kiev, and those cities were much less likely to accept Jewish applicants, much less Jewish applicants from outside their own city limits, sought to pursue the advanced degree of Doctor of Medicine and had the means to do so, by and large, took the cosmopolitan path through Europe's medical schools. Among this group were Jewish students who disproportionately came from German merchant families and who were thus able to train in the German-speaking world, in Austria, Switzerland, Germany. For the second half of the 19th century, nearly a third of the membership of the Society of Odessa Doctors were graduates of German universities. Because German-speaking countries were generally welcoming to paying foreign students, but inhospitable to Russian Jews taking jobs, Odessa's Jewish graduates tended to return home to establish their practices. Odessa's clinical infrastructure was both thriving and hospitable to newly minted Jewish doctors from Europe, partially because Jews were well placed in the city's medical administration and private nursing homes, psychiatric institutions, and sanatoriums. For those who took the cosmopolitan path to their careers, Odessa was a plush place to practice, with physicians in full or part-time private practice earning an annual average of 3,600 rubles in 1889, compared to St. Petersburg's 2,200 rubles and Moscow's 1,700 rubles. Not to speak of the pittances that village and district physicians made in the central provision and Zemstvo governments. This landscape created the conditions for Jewish doctors to be among the first to introduce the radical new science of psychoanalysis, which was characterized as a Jewish science in German-speaking countries, but in Odessa was presented as a European or Western innovation as early as 1908. The long-standing historian of the psychoanalytic movement, Ernst Jones, would later describe the early years of psychoanalysis in Russia as more liberal than Germany. Although Russian psychoanalysis was not generally characterized as explicitly Jewish before 1925, the medical community did imagine its appearance in the Russian Empire as emerging from Odessa. A skeptic of psychoanalysis based in St. Petersburg, Dr. Alexander Mendelssohn, suggested that the physician Pivnitsky, who embraced psychoanalysis as a cure for alcoholism as early as 1910, must have come in contact with Freud's ideas while on military assignment in Odessa. Freud seemed to share this view of Odessa. Writing to Carl Jung in 1912, Freud remarked that in Odessa, quote, "there seems to be a local epidemic of psychoanalysis." This is an unfortunate word today, but it was hardly an epidemic, but the first stirrings of the adoption of Freudian methods certainly seemed promising. A smattering of advertisements for the analytic method of treatment in Odessa's private hospitals and sanatoriums had appeared in the local papers by 1912. Freud must have devoted considerable time to Russian doctors who traveled to Vienna because his acolyte Wilhelm Steckel wrote to Freud on June 1st, 1912, quote, "I oftentimes wished I lived in Odessa or Hamburg and could come to Vienna for a week. Nothing alienates more than proximity." End quote. 2 years later, Freud had a change of heart about the epidemic in Odessa. He wrote in his History of the Psychoanalytic Movement that, quote, "the contributions written by Russian physicians and psychiatrists are not at present noteworthy. Only Odessa possesses a trained psychoanalyst in the person of Moshe Wolf." If Freud saw Wolf as singular from his vantage point in Vienna, Wolf's development was characteristic of the career track in which Jewish doctors in Odessa operated. Born in 1878 to a German Jewish merchant family, Wolf graduated from the medical track of Odessa's Imperial University, which, as I mentioned, didn't have a medical school at the time. And since he was amongst those students who did aspire for the coveted advanced degree of medical doctor, and could speak German and could afford to pursue his studies abroad, he pursued his medical studies in Berlin, where he found Freud's writings and trained with the psychoanalyst Karl Abraham in 1906. Expelled from his clinical position at the Berlin Clinic for practicing psychoanalysis, and subsequently rejected from publishing articles with quote unquote psychoanalytic content in German language journals, Wolf returned to Odessa, set up a private practice in the lower Alexandrovsky Streets part of the city center. And it is here that Wolf treated Freud's most famous patient, Sergei Penkoff, known into the world as the Wolfman, and enjoyed the fruitful collaboration of colleagues sympathetic to the new science. Thus, Freud singling out Wolf for being the single psychoanalytic voice in Russia who, quote, spoke of the neuroses of childhood with great understanding, end quote, offers more insight into Freud's disappointment with what he saw as the abandonment of his internally driven drive theory than the reality on the ground in Russia. From the perspective of Wolf's position in Russia's medical scene, Freud's assessment that, quote, the contributions written, and there I'm emphasizing the word written, by Russian physicians and psychiatrists are not at present noteworthy, pinpointed the all too real gap between clinical practice and research that marked Odessa's medical scene. In fact, I would argue that the circumstances facing Russia's analysts sometimes resulted in clinical advances well ahead of the Viennese circle in certain key regards, which gets lost in the passage from Russian clinical practices to research publications. The disconnect between the clinical experience of Odessa's analysts and their presentation of research was most pronounced in their treatment of children and pre-edible patients. Pre-edible meaning that they had characterological issues as opposed to conflict issues, whom Freud believed to be untreatable with the talking cure. Russia's analysts treated different types of patients than the Viennese and German analysts. That is, they tended to treat orphan children, which the revolution and the Civil War only made more numerous after 1917 to 1919. And they also tended to treat adults with the sort of psychosis that comes about as a symptom of syphilis, since Odessa was a major treatment center for syphilis madness. Partially because of their different clientele, the Odessan group often used art in their clinical work and often dealt with the theoretical properties of the creative faculties and processes in their research, which Freud saw as an assault to his Oedipal theory, but that would become a major movement in the object relations school in England after the Second World War. Thus, Freud's singling out of Wolf also contributes to our understanding of how the cosmopolitan path produced a very thin historical record on Odessa's analysts. While the hierarchies in Russia's medical histories might account for the oversight of Odessa's medical research, I'm convinced, at least for now, that the reason Odessa's analytic orientation has attracted little, if any, independent attention from the Freudians is precisely because its findings often diverged from Freud's centralization of neurosis. I'm considering the hypothesis that Freud singled out Wolf because Wolf was unique, not in his views, but in his ability to align his research to Freud's framework on neurosis. I mean, not in the ways that he was actually unique, but in the ways he was able to conform. Of course, there was a price to pay for Wolf's adaptability. In his work, if his work conformed enough to be presented within mainstream Freudian circles, it was nonetheless channeled through Freud's editorial mill, which often resulted in conclusions that appeared inelegantly attached to the demonstration of clinical material. Okay, so for example, in 1911, Wolf submitted his paper on the usefulness of lies in psychoanalysis to Vienna's Centralblatt, a journal edited by Freud and Steckel at that time. Wolf recounts a patient's dream in which 2 new hires at his office cost him his job, a Mr. Nathanson and a Mr. Yashimovich. The patient admits right after he tells the dream, he says, "Oh, I lied in recounting the dream, and I fabricated those 2 names." Rather than treating the lies as the patient's resistance to treatment and returning to the scrupulous archaeology of the real dream, as Freud might have done, Wolf seemed to be demonstrating the usefulness of the patient's manifest material or the presentation of the lies to the psychoanalyst. Wolf recounts that when the patient reveals that he had lied, he profitably produces a number of psychologically rich associations until he realizes that the false name, Yashimovich, refers to Ya, I in Russian, and Shimovich, a name suffix, thereby finally able to acknowledge his own role in the loss of his employment, or in this case, the fear of the loss of his employment. But the paper that Wolf submitted oddly concludes with an altogether different conclusion that appears unrelated to Wolf's presentation of clinical material. The paper concludes that the patient projects his internal hostility onto the outside world that comes back to him in the form of the paranoid delusion of persecution. Wolf writes a note that he is happy that his work, quote, supports Freud's paper on paranoia, end quote, which Freud had not even published at the time that Wolf originally sent his paper in for publication. A letter from Steckel to Freud on July 7th, 1911, sheds light on this disassociated conclusion. Steckel writes to Freud that, quote, Wolf gave me permission to carry through improvements and cutbacks as I see fit. I intend to use it in accordance with your intentions, end quote. The final published paper thus uses Wolf's findings to support Freud's definition of the phenomenon of paranoia, and Wolf's article on lies in psychoanalysis appeared with the parenthetical subtitle, Simultaneously a Contribution to the Psychology of Paranoia. Although scholars have long acknowledged Freud's autocratic leadership of the psychoanalytic movement, they tend to overlook his heavy-handed handling of Russian analysts, specifically because scholars tend to focus on censorship in Russia from a domestic lens. Yet, as the above scenario exemplifies, the historical rewriting of Russia's analytic literature was also initiated from abroad, which is unfortunate, partially because Odessa's Jewish analysts faced very different cultural and professional concerns than Freudian circles in Europe. Wolf, like his colleagues in Odessa and later Moscow, was more interested in socially driven explanations of the human psyche. I would argue that Freud misunderstood Wolf's core concerns, a misunderstanding with which Wolf colluded to some degree, likely a result of some combination of idealization of Freud and Wolf's desire to secure academic recognition in Russia, which was greatly improved by international support. Indeed, if we follow the trajectory of Wolf's publishing course in Russia, we find Wolf's core concerns revolve around the nature of lies as socially useful fictions, which he extended to a paper on the survivalist function of coquetry, flirting, another type of lie thought to be specific to women, and to the psychological benefits of fairy tales and the development of children. So if I were to end my talk in 1925, the end date designated by our conference today on cosmopolitanism in urban spaces, I would conclude that the cosmopolitan path that Jewish doctors in Odessa took to launch their careers also played into the provincialization of their scientific contributions. And this is true, of course, but there's more to say specifically about the Jewish connection to psychoanalysis after 1925, when psychoanalysis finally acquired the patent of Jewishness that had so long been associated with psychoanalysis in German-speaking countries. As fervent scientists sought to purge the old system, aspects of which often were cloaked in anti-Semitic language, the psychoanalytic focus on the individual, with a divided self perpetually at war with itself, fell suspect as a Jewish/imperialist view of the human psyche. Like their counterparts in Europe at the turn of the 20th century, Jewish analysts in Russia defended their science against ethnicization. In 1926, Wolf delivered a presentation to an educational board of the Communist Party on behalf of traditional fairy tales, which had fallen into ideological disrepute, both for their perceived religious backwardness and for reflecting ethical lapses like lying, cheating, and exploitation. The Children's Proletarian Cultural and Educational Organization, quote, sought to eradicate folktales on the basis that they glorified tsars and tsarinas, corrupted and instigated sickly fantasies in children, and developed the kulak, or rich farmer attitude, and strengthened bourgeois ideals. This is where my work currently lies. Wolf's address to the Communist Party is fascinating for several reasons. We see Wolf defending traditional Russian culture with Jewish science, which means very different things in 1920s Moscow than it did in Freud's Vienna in 1900. Yet, Wolf's core thesis, that is about the therapeutic nature of fantasy and the social development of the human psyche, was one that Wolf had been honing and developing since his return to Odessa from his medical training in Berlin. But that has been lost within the Freudian framework of neurosis. By 1926, my point about the price that Jewish doctors on the cosmopolitan path paid in their original research hardly requires any proof. While the framing of psychoanalysis as a European import played very well into its introduction in Odessa in 1908, the notion that it was a scientific theory imported from the West would undo it in Moscow in the 1920s. Within a year of Wolf's address to the Communist Party, fairy tales won, but psychoanalysis lost in the ideological restructuring of Russian life, which motivated Wolf to emigrate to Berlin in 1927. Thus, while Wolf anticipated many new ideas that would become mainstay in psychoanalytic thought, such as the social use of fantasy that the object relations school would arrive at years later, he would receive only a footnote in its history.
Thank you very much to Maya.
Thank you.
And it's a really impressive presentation. So 2 questions, please. Yes, Sveta, please.
I would like, thank you very much for such an illuminating presentation. I would like to ask about patients of Wolf. Who's aware, whether we have some information about them, where did they come from?
So in Odessa, he lived on Pushkinskaya 55 in the center of town. And this was also the address of the, the Russian school number 10. So, and we have that he recorded, he wrote about children as clinical material. So I don't know if the children came from the school or from elsewhere, but we know that he saw children, young pre-Oedipal children. And he also wrote about hysterical attacks, this term is very outdated, but psychotic attacks or episodes in children. So we do have a lot of information about the sort of symptoms that they had and whom he treated, but I don't have exact information because of course it all gets left behind. He doesn't take it with him to Berlin, and then in 1933 he has to leave Berlin and he ends up in Tel Aviv, and here he starts psychoanalysis in Israel, and it's its own whole other story. But when he goes to Moscow after the First World War, he works in a children's home, the famous children's home of Yuri Schmidt, and there's lots of information about that, not that he wrote down, but that she recorded. She wrote a book about it, and he saw children there that were orphans from the revolution, but also, Stalin sent his son there. that they were also a place for the children of party leaders.
One more question. All right, thank you.
I would ask something.
Mirja, yes.
I was very intrigued by the fact that you stressed social interests more than individual problems in the interests of Wolf. Can you say a couple of words about that?
I think that the Russian analyst, Wolf understood better than most people because, he was in contact with Freud. He was in Vienna, by the way, for almost 2 years. And he translated Freud. So he really introduced Freud in a lot of ways to a Russian public. And Freud had a heavy hand in that. There's a lot to say about that. But I think that the Russians generally, and at the core, Wolf also, didn't really understand this great divide that it has to stay, that fantasy is the site of conflict. They were more interested in the development of the child or the human psyche in the social world. And they just didn't put as much stress. Freud was crazy about this point. And that's why the Russians loved Adler. Even though Freud split with Adler ended up being kind of, more important than Freud in some ways. So they didn't take issue with this.
Thank you. Thank you. And our next speaker is Svetlana Natkovich. Dr. Svetlana Natkovich is a senior lecturer at the Department of Jewish History in the University of Haifa. She is an author of a broad-scale study on the literature of Vladimir Zhabotinsky, Among Radiant Clouds, the literature of Vladimir Zev Zhabotinsky in its social context. She is an editor and translator to Hebrew of a known autobiographical text by Abraham Uri Kovner. Her current research deals with questions of literary self-fashioning of Russian Jewish intellectuals in the second half of the 19th century. And the subject of her presentation is the economics of Odessa Jewish literature, from Sholom Aleichem to Ilf and Petrov.
Thank you very much, Roman. I will share my presentation. Just a moment. And we'll start. Oops. Okay. Yeah. So in 1901 collection of stereoscopic slides that was issued in the United States under the title Russia Through the Stereoscope, in the chapter Wheat for Export Odessa, that most likely accompanied this picture, following text appeared. It's a curious experience to go about the wharves and these adjoining streets and see business in progress. Yonder are the ships and steamers ready to carry Russian foodstuff to all parts of the world. But it's not this square, but is not this square full of grain bags and meditative steers a strange compound of the commercial and the pastoral? Those loads must be tremendously heavy. No wonder the hard-worked beasts are glad to take their recess time lying down. But the effect suggests cattle pieces in a Hermitage picture galleries rather than hustle and bustle of the docks. The contents of this fat bags may have come from Little Russia. There are rich grain lands in those regions, as well as in the valley of Volga. The grain has come down the river, and now here it is, ready for shipment to feed other lands with less broad fields. It is noteworthy that most of the text, and I will return to the picture, does not refer to the life in Odessa, but represent other places. The Hermitage, the rich grain lands of Little Russia and the Volga Valley, barges that transport grain down the river, steamers that carry Russian grain to other lands. For the tourists seeking the exotic, Odessa was presented as a point of collision of two different and recognizable worlds of production and consumption, of the pastoral, meditative steers and the most advanced transportation technologies. Yes, although there is a claim here in the title to represent Odessa's business world, specifically the Odessa setting that actually facilitated and enabled the export operations remains unseen. As if all this was taking place in another temporal and spatial dimension, undetectable by the stereoscopic camera of the outsider. In this presentation, I will attempt to reverse the gaze, and instead of looking at Odessa from the outside, I will try to look at the outer world from this liminal dimension, in the fault line between the autocratic agricultural Russia, mainland Russia, and the international trade routes of global capitalism. I would claim that this specific business setting of Odessa's trade was, among other things, responsible for molding Odessa's literary poetics and myths. The myth of the city where powerful, confident, shrewd Jewish characters dwelt, where life was easy, humorous, and full of adventures and possibilities. Some of them legal and some not so much, as was emphasized in short pieces on Odessa by Jabotinsky and Babel. A scholar of Odessa literature, Rebecca Stanton, has characterized the tradition of Odessa literature and Russian culture by following interrelated discursive features. The paradox, multivocality, and carnivalesque inversion, a sense of exile in both time and space, often manifested in the narrator's positioning of himself as an outsider in the world he depicts, a roguish manipulation of the distinctions between autobiographical and fictional narrative, and preoccupation with stories, often lies, and it's in a very continuous motif in Maya's presentation, stories and lies that come true, and the inverse, truth that becomes stories. I will try to show to what extent those tropes were forged by the very dynamics of the grain trade in Odessa port and Odessa's commodities exchange. Soon after its foundation in 1794, Odessa became a gateway of Russian grain into Western markets. And I really like this map, which in a way, map of Odessa, but the vantage point is above port, like port is the heart of the city and not the city itself. The inception of Odessa grain trade, which at its beginning was dominated by Greek commercial firms, the most common marketing strategy was the transportation of grain to the port by producers and its direct sale to foreign purchasers. But instead of the direct sale of the commodities, in the middle of the 19th century, futures transactions became the prevalent form of commerce there. Futures commerce presupposes contracts for future crops when the profit is generated from the difference between the agreed price and the actual price of the commodity in the specific day of the consummation of the contract, the accounting day. But, and this is the most crucial point, since the moment of its initiation, the contract itself becomes a commodity that could be bought, sold, and speculated in detachment from the actual conditions of the production and demand for the original commodity. The introduction of futures commerce in Odessa grain markets happened at a time when Jewish merchants took over the domination of the city's commerce from Greek firms. And later I will address the reason for this change. Although both processes were precipitated by their own, not necessarily interconnected reasons, the dynamics of futures commerce and the patterns of subjectivity it produced, especially in the Russian context, became associated with the profile of Odessa Jewish businessmen and later with Odessan mentality and worldview in general. I suggest that we should see this particular pattern of grain commerce that gradually developed in Odessa throughout the 19th century as one of the formative factors of formation of the Odessa myth as was proliferated in the literature. The emergence of a credit economy in the 18th and 19th century in the West necessitated the formation of new models of cognitive, temporal, and aesthetic and psychological perception. The appearance of new financial instruments such as credit and futures contracts brought about a new problematization of the concept of the real. As literary scholar Anna Kornbluch has noted, credit instruments and the development of credit markets fomented a state of trade in which it is impossible to decide what part of the trade arises out of real bona fide transactions, such as actual bargain or sale, and what part is fictitious and mere an accommodation paper. That is, where one bill is drawn up to take another running in order to raise fictitious capital. In the initial stride of this running, credit instruments operate by deferring the completion of a sale. It is impossible to decide in the present tense whether that sale will be completed. Only the future may finalize this sale. Any creditor's transaction remains in a state of perpetual suspense, respecting its bona fides until such moment in the future when its authenticity will have been confirmed. And here we can speak about other places in the world which established futures commerce. Definitely Odessa wasn't the first one. But I think what was unique in Odessa setting is symbiosis of exchange, of existence of exchange trade and real port when real grain was all the time present, as we could have seen on the picture on the real streets of the city. And this cognitive dissonance between seeing real grain and realizing that it's not real product, but only possibility for another run of the promising of the financial documents. This cognitive dissonance was very important, in my opinion. Literary scholar Joshua Clover, in his analysis of the problem of value and temporality in the postmodern finance system, has emphasized the disruption of cause and effect relationships in these conditions. The operation of financial markets presupposes the retroactive actualization of value. When effect, the final price of the commodity set on the agreed day of consummation of the contract, is perceived as determining the cause, a chain of speculative stock transactions. I argue that Odessa's unique circumstances as both an actual port in which bona fide deals were carried out and palpable commodities transported, and site of commodities exchange operating through abstract time and values, made it an exemplary site for the interaction between pre-modern and modern economic and conceptual systems. In a paradoxical way, literary tropes that became associated later with Odessa literature started to emerge in their distinctive form at the very time when the city's commercial glory began to deteriorate. One of the reasons for this shift was the deterioration of Russia's status as a world supplier of grain. After the Crimean War, which ended in 1856, West discovered new markets of grain in the US and Argentina. While the Greek firms were still used to work as monopolists with very broad margins of profit, Jewish merchants were able to buy grain directly from the producer, to modernize the chain of supply, to reduce the profit margin, and to keep the business active despite the competition. So, for example, if in the 1860s the average profit of the dealer was 5 to 10 kopeek for 1 pud of the sold grain, in the following decades, it shrunk down to 1/4 kopeek. And we can keep in mind this information when we see the change in the demography of grain merchants in Odessa, and we see that ostensibly Jewish merchants became much more dominant after 1870s, but actually this large amount of merchants were earning much less than previous generation of Greek merchants, whose profit margins were much larger. The market conditions forced Odessa businessmen to develop expertise in several fields of specialization that in other markets were often separate. According to Patricia Herzliya, the advantage of Jewish merchants in Odessa grain market was precisely the ability to talk with both local producers and foreign purchasers and to be able to link them as it were two worlds. And we obviously we keep in mind that the most valuable asset of Greek merchants were another merchant companies across the Mediterranean, while largest asset of Jewish merchants after 1870s were the connections in the mainland Russia, in the Pale of Settlement, that enabled them to organize purchase and shipment and transportation very effectively. The specificity of Odessa's grain market fashioned the Odessan subject as an historical, social, and literary phenomenon in opposition to the business culture of the Russian interior, but also simultaneously as able to internalize the codes of this culture and to combine them into a more complex and abstract perception of economic exchange and social relations. The outcome was the formation of liminal subjectivity, which belonged and yet was alienated from both capitalist commerce and traditional trade. The quintessential Odessan represented in the city's folklore that started being articulated in the second half of the 19th century was able to combine the personal and impersonal, concrete and the abstract, the historical and mythical, linear perception of time, and fragmented or circular time narratives, and manipulate all of them to his or her advantage. Here we see similar characteristics of the Odessa literary trope, summarized earlier, which I presented earlier in the summary of Rebecca Stanton. Paradoxically, although existential indeterminacy was the most characteristic condition of Odessa's business world, its actors imagined their own existence as mediators between the production and consumption, between real and fictitious, as the only stable point of world's economic and political system. Sholom Aleichem portrayed in his Menachem Mendel this sort of mediation as a sophisticated chicanery. His representative of Odessa business world is significantly named Gambita, from the word gambit, which is the opening move in the chess game, which literal meaning is to put leg forward in order to trip someone. In the beginning, Gambita maintains Menachem Mendel's illusion of control over his business affairs. He adjusts a complex system of factors regulating the market rates to coincide with Menachem Mendel's perception, which is based on shtetl politics, and palpable perception of commodity based on the direct trade and bona fide transactions. In thousands of ways, he can prove you that there is a smell of war in the air. This is from the letter of Menachem Mendel to his wife in the shtetl. He says that every single night he can hear cannon shots, not here, but over there in France. The French, he says, will never forget that man Bismarck as long as they live. If you listen to Gambita preach, you will have to sell everything you own, down to your coat, in order to buy stallages and bases without end. Stallages and bases, which are 19th century Russian terms for different transactions in futures commerce, are presented here as palpable commodities in the perception, through the perception of Menachem Mendel. Gambita does everything in his power to prevent Menachem Mendel from selling his futures in order to keep prices up. One of his strategies is to represent the world history as a fabric of shtetl-like gossip accumulating in Odessa's grain commerce. Gambita fuels Menachem Mendel imagination to the point that the latter sees the Queen of England, Bismarck, and himself as directly connected through the mysterious roots of the grain trade. However, when Gambita uses the same forms of speech, the roots of trade are concrete and calculable, whereas the Queen of England and Bismarck are only metonymical signifiers of complex power relations. When the bankrupt Menachem Mendel accuses Gambita of being the cause of his calamity, the latter replies, one has to understand the stock exchange. If one does not know how to deal in London, one should stick to rugs and old bottles. And London here, obviously, is the rates set in London's exchange for the commodity. But Menachem Mendel refers to London as if it's commodity itself, and he all the time speaks about trading in London. In other words, Gambita recommends Menachem Mendel to stick to pre-capitalist world of bona fide transactions. Thus, Gambita, the quintessential Odessa Jewish merchant, is represented in Sholom Aleichem's novel as a sophisticated rogue, cynically using Menachem Mendel's misunderstanding of the situation for his own ends. Jabotinsky's novel The Five, depicting a similar setting of Odessa's Jewish commercial milieu, was written more than 40 years after Sholom Aleichem's masterpiece and almost 2 decades after Odessa's exchange brokers made their last contract. But actually it refers to the same period of time as Menachem Mendel. Unlike Sholom Aleichem, Jabotinsky wrote from the standpoint of nostalgic identification with Odessa's bourgeois milieu and its mythology. In The Five, the Gambita-like character of Abram Moiseyevich in contrast to his predecessor in Menachem Mendel, is represented as a pillar of society and one of the most appealing figures in the novel. However, similar to Gambita, Abraham Moiseyevich and his broker friends tend to represent world's history as a derivative of the Odessa Grand Trade. The old man could recount in entertaining and enjoyable terms, writes Jabotinsky, the history of the Sevastopol campaign, Abraham Lincoln's death, the Paris Commune, Skobelev, Zhelabov's trial, Boulanger, and various affairs pertaining to the Black Sea grain trade. But Jabotinsky delves further to depict the Odessa merchants' perceptions of the unique historical and existential position vis-a-vis the world history on the one hand and circulations of commodities on the other. He describes it in the following way. Along thousands of roads throughout the Ukraine, carts creaked and Ukrainians shouted encouragement to the oxen. They were transporting grain from all corners to the piers of our magnanimous Dnieper. And the life of some 40 million people depended on how the rates of various grains were set in this season by the Odessa brokers in the bulletin. And these rates in turn depended on whether or not the alarming rumors turned out to be justified, namely that the Sultan wanted to block passage through the Dardanelles once again. And these rumors were a result of some events in India or Persia, and somehow or other the Emperor Franz Joseph was involved, and the Empress Maria Fedorovna, and the French Premier Combes, and so on and so forth. Jabotinsky's cosmology here is composed of three economic habitats intersecting in Odessa's commercial activity, and I return you to with which I started my presentation. On the one hand, it corresponds to the world of production in the Ukrainian mainland, characterized by direct affinity with nature and by concrete time derived from the repetitive cycles of agricultural labor. On the other hand, it reflects the complex sphere of international relationships and high politics made up of singular and irrevocable events oriented toward the future and entangled in the baffling system of relationships between causes and effects. But between these two dynamic worlds, Jabotinsky identifies a third one. While the life of 40 million people depends on the rates set by Odessa brokers in the bulletin, and those rates depend in turn on unpredictable events in world history, the existence of Odessa brokers and their bulletin itself remains the only stable and changing component of this tripartite system, virtually uninfluenced by the turmoil of other components. Odessa functions as a site of conversion of use values into exchange values. It's crucial to both worlds, but belongs to neither. In fact, in Jabotinsky's cosmology, Odessa's quintessential grain merchant exists outside of time, both cyclic and linear, concrete and abstract. The internalization of this position produces a unique perception of history, according to which every historical event pertains to the Black Sea grain trade, as though it was the Archimedean point of civilization. With all the ideological and poetical differences of Isaac Babel's Odessa stories from Jabotinsky, he too portrayed Odessa as an anchor point of civilization, the place that things are done in, that exists in the special time and space. The only chronologically identifiable stories in Babel's Odessa story cycle are about annihilation of Odessa microcosm, only after the revolution, 1917 revolution. Otherwise, Odessa in its glory exists outside of identifiable time or causal relationships. As in the five, when history infiltrates the life of characters, it brings destruction and calamities with it. Suggestively, the mode of transportation connecting Odessa to the outer world in Babel's story is a ship called Plutarch, named after ancient Greek historian. With the departure of the Plutarch, Odessa becomes detached from the world history. Unlike Babel, who didn't deal directly with the actual commercial world of Odessa grain dealers in the time of annihilation of this commerce after the Bolshevik Revolution, his younger fellow Soviet writers in the Odessa school in the 1920s, Ilf and Evgeny Petrov, referred specifically to the world of once powerful grain merchants in the picaresque novel, The Little Golden Calf, which was already mentioned by Efraim. Unlike Jabotinsky's omnipotent merchants, Ilf and Petrov's ex-brokers are harmless and, more importantly, irrelevant to history and even to the unfolding of the narrative. I will not read this citation, which whoever is familiar with Odessa literature knows very well, about brokers gathering next to former Florida Cafe, which is perhaps a homage to Fanconi Cafe, and remembers wonderful time when they could wheel and deal. And despite the ridicule of the ex-Odessa brokers, the pattern of their perception that constantly mediated between the real and fictitious infiltrated the logic of behavior of Ilf and Petrov's roguish protagonist, Ostap Bender, and entered their poetics. When the actual business culture that produced those patterns of thought ceased to exist, Odessa myth, formulated on its base, continued to proliferate even in detachment from the actual description of Odessa trade. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Svetlana. Okay, stop sharing the screen and we will take.
I try to do it and I cannot. Sorry.
Okay, now it's okay.
Yeah.
All right, somebody? Yes, please, Alexander.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I guess I should introduce myself briefly. My name is Alexander Zabirko. I'm from the Ruhr University Bochum in Germany, and I'm also part of the research group. I guess this will do. And I have a very, well, rather brief and kind of general question to Svetlana. We see at least in your description, the history of Odessa is more or less a history of decline. And if so, would you call the literature you analyze in its undertone kind of nostalgic literature? And if yes, is there an idea of golden age in it, sort of point of return, a sort of kind of point which should be restored or whatever? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexander. And it's really interesting because every generation is longing for the generation before it. For example, in Jabotinsky's The Five, we see very strong presence of the time of those uncles, Abram Moiseyevich and Boris Moiseyevich. But if we calculate when there was a golden period of those uncles, which is presumably 1870s, in 1870s, we already find, not in literature, but in journalistic writing, we find already this nostalgic modus of seeing that Odessa trade deteriorates and there's nothing like it was before. And recently I found even in the text in 1860, which is really only 1 year after the free port status, after the Porto Franco status was taken from Odessa. And already in 1860s, they actually nostalgicize toward 1840s, because apparently this Porto Franco status was not taken off at once. It was taken off in some portions, and they are nostalgic for the 1840s, which was actually the time when biggest profits were made on the trade. But even in the 1840s, in some very small, really journalistic sketches, they are already nostalgic for the Ribas time, from the time of pioneers when everything was possible. So in a way, is nostalgia, if we speak about signifier and signified, it's like signifier without the signified. They are nostalgicizing for something that is almost already lost, always already lost. This is the dynamics. And I really cannot explain it, because we can explain it when we speak about 1870s and they say, okay, they are longing for the period of Porto Franco. But even in the period of Porto Franco, they longing for something else. So it goes deep.
All right. We have one question here from Yohanan Petrovsky. But I suggest, Efraim, I suggest that this question is very big scaled. Let's postpone this to the end of the meeting. All right?
Okay.
Or Yohanan would just join this Zoom meeting and ask the question by himself.
Yes, well, Yochanan says that he's unable at the moment for personal reasons to join. But I think it's a general question, and it'll be good to ask at the end of the discussion.
All right. More questions for Mirja?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on this nostalgia question that has been with us for a while. But still, nostalgia is of a specific kind in Odessa. Don't you agree that it has this really cheerful atmosphere around it, and it is not a very darkish, grayish type of nostalgia? So I would like to ask whether people are longing, but they still enjoy their present, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And nostalgia provides the model of how it should be done. And they, in a way, in their perception, they reiterate this model. And I think maybe it's like Odessa was kind of Wild West of Russia, when people came to frontier and started do something from the scratch. And this fantasy of being a pioneer, coming to the frontier, was very persistent and very productive in the literature. And even and here really I cannot say whether Odessa was very special here, but Jabotinsky and in childhood memories of Tchaikovsky and Kataev brother, the issue of adventure, of going out to adventure, of running out of the school for an adventure, which is obviously general trope of children literature in general. In Odessa, it was really part of the education of Bildung process of boys mainly. I don't know about girls there, but it was very central trope.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much. Okay, so I suggest that we'll make a little break. Okay, 5 minutes of break. It's okay?
Yes.
Fine.
So we will return in 5 minutes. Just stop video if you want, or mute audio, and we'll be back. Right? Thank you. All right, we're back. And just perhaps we'll wait for Elena. Here she is. All right. We're all here, and now we're proceeding to the second part of this meeting. And the first speaker in the second part would be Professor Dr. Mirja Lecke. She's a chair of Slavic literature at University of Regensburg. Her academic interests include Russian literature of the imperial and post-Soviet periods, as well as Polish literature of the Enlightenment and post-communist eras. She published widely on literary Odessa. She is an author of a monograph about the representation of the Western borderlands in Russian imperial literature, Westland, Polen und die Ukraine in der russischen Literatur von Pushkin bis Babel. And she is co-edited with Elena Chhaidze, a volume on Russian-Georgian literary relations of the post-Soviet era. Her presentation is called Odessa Literary Modernism, the topos of the street. Mirja?
Thank you so much. Also, thank you for hosting us and making this all possible under these really hard circumstances. Thanks a lot for that. I will probably start sharing my screen. Okay, this doesn't work.
You want me to share my screen?
I cannot share my screen. I cannot share my screen for some reason. I have a new computer and he's asking me to make downloads before I can enable sharing the screen.
Would you like me to share your presentation here?
That would be ideal. Can you do it, please?
Yes, just a moment. All right.
Oh, now he's offering it. I can still try. Oh, can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Works.
Okay, I was able to do it anyways. Great. Thank you. Okay, I'll start right away so that we don't lose too much time. I will start with a quotation from a book of a German traveler who visited Odessa in 1837. So as we already know, the city was still very young back then. And this is what he wrote about his impressions. In the streets everywhere you hear Russian, English, Italian, German, Yiddish, Tatar, and other languages. And that not only from single strangers passing by, but from a multitude of local people that live here. The confusion of languages is great in all of Russia, but in Odessa, the confusion has reached a peak as high as in Babylon. And then he goes on, here you see things unheard of in other Russian cities, people that stick flowers in their buttonhole, appearing in this way in public places, even a certain laxness in clothing, fluttering scarves, etc. People smoke on the streets. On the balconies of the houses, one sees young ladies and gentlemen engaged in joking banter, all things that do not happen in interior Russia. One says almost anything one is in the mood for when it comes to politics, often speaking about Russia as if it were a foreign country. Close quote. Why I chose this quotation while I will be talking about modernism, I think that Kohl in these passages raises issues that were crucial for Odessa's functioning in Russian cultural history until well into the 20th century. And I will be also talking about them today. This is multi-ethnicity, liberalism in political thought and manners, and another crucial point is a feeling of separateness from the rest of Russia. I will focus on one aspect of the Odessa text, as Rebecca Stanton has it. I will concentrate on depictions of street life, which recur with remarkable frequency in texts written in Russian. And they form an important and politically charged topos. I will argue that descriptions of the Odessan street privilege sensual experience, and in particular acoustic oral impressions, and that Odessa in these descriptions lacks the metaphysically dangerous phantasmagoric dimension that has been shown to be typical of St. Petersburg, as described by Lotman and Tabarov. Texts about Odessa Street raise issues that are at the core of the urban modernization. These are the experience of a socially complex and technologically modern environment, and also the individual's encounter with strangers and with the selves. But I want to show that these encounters happen in a manner significantly different from what has been grasped with figures such as the flaneur, the idle and yet restless urban explorer, who became an important conceptual notion in describing the experience of modernity. Moreover, the Odessan street is used as a literary vehicle to discuss ethnic diversity and social existence rather than individual alienation. Therefore, the images of Odessa streets provide insight into a distinct set of changing perceptions of the self and the individual's role in the public realm that sets, in my opinion, Odessan street literature apart from literary portrayals, for example, of St. Petersburg. Before I turn to my examples from Russian literature, I want to explain shortly why the street is a motif that ties together aesthetics and politics so firmly. Answers to this question can be found in the field of urban studies. The condition of the modern self has always been closely tied to the city's architectural structures and to the social practices they facilitated. But already since antiquity, streets and squares have also been very important for social interaction and also for political identity, as they provided space for civic discussion. But most crucially for modern times, as Richard Sennett has argued, the street is a politically charged stage where people present themselves by performing certain gestures and movements and also by wearing clothes. And while they are performing on the stage of the street, they are watched by other people, and this creates, according to Sennett, a public geography in which political hierarchies are reflected and negotiated. Walking through urban space as an end in itself originated around 1800, but only in the second half of the 19th century with Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal, the flaneur became the literary figure that served to artistically reflect the solitude and the profaneness of modern life, as well as possible new forms of community. Already in the 20th century, Walter Benjamin characterized the flaneur as a bourgeois, detached observer that moves through cityscape almost unconsciously. When we look at texts about Odessa, we find figures akin and structures also akin to these concepts derived from West European culture. But I think we should also be very sensitive to ways in which Odessa might differ from them. This I would like to illustrate on one example. As Patricia Herzliya points out in her history of Odessa, the city was designed along the lines of Western enlightened urban planning, and it has this regular grid pattern in the city center that enables surveillance and subdivision, at least in the cities in the New World. And Herzliya comments on that. She says this type of city structure facilitated in the New World ethnic coexistence by subdividing ethnic groups into neighborhoods that are more or less ethnically homogeneous. And in that, Odessa differs. We have also multi-ethnic coexistence, but it was spatially differently organized. We have no significant subdivision into ethnic neighborhoods, but we have a coexistence in houses. So people live of different faiths and ethnic origins lived in spatial proximity, their houses being rather, they shared houses, but they were vertically stratified. That means socially subdivided, and this reflected social status. So we had ground floors and prestigious living space in the first and second floors, and then less desirable other locations in the house. So we see that the Odessa street grid looks like a Western enlightened model, but it functioned differently in the social reality of pre-revolutionary Odessa. But what is interesting is that in Odessan literature, interethnic contact is nonetheless mostly represented as something that happens on the street. So even though people lived in different ethnic combinations and houses, they wrote about seeing and performing their ethnic identity rather in public spaces on the street. And public space plays a paramount role in Odessa modernism. I will now turn to my examples from literature. And I will start around in the 1910s, when a new generation of authors came to dominate Odessa's literary scene. Among the new young authors was most famously Eduard Bar-Ilan and also the other protagonists that I will be talking about, Yuri Alyosha. The two of them later moved to Moscow in the 1920s, and there it was in 1933 that Viktor Shklovsky tried to promote these young authors from Odessa as a generation with a worldview that could be innovative and could give the Soviet literature a new development. As we all know, he wasn't successful with this proposition. But in the years up to the Civil War, these young poets still were in Odessa, and they discovered the street as something that they tied to a new modernist aesthetic that was characterized by a radical renunciation of naturalist moralizing, and which was characteristic, I think, of Odessan modernism. They all had a retreat from subject-centered artistic expression. And I think I can show this on a couple of examples. I will first talk about Eduard Bar-Ilan, whose oeuvre is full of city poems, quite significant city poetry, and it deals exclusively with exterior space, most prominently the market and the port and the street. So I will just give you a small glance of the poem that I will be talking about, but I will give the quotations in English as well. I think this poem, written, published under the pseudonym of Nina Voskresensky, Deriba Street at Night is the title of 1915, shows very well how Bar-Ilan constructs the street and public space in his early poetry. The poem bears many traits of modernist city representations, lots of dissociated impressions, and very dominant imagery of technology. But whereas generally in modernist literary texts, we have an overabundance of central impression that is connected to alienation, to angst, or at least a challenge of the subject, Bar-Ilan has no noticeable estrangement expressed in this poem. He rather builds up a self-sufficient tidal wave of overwhelming sensual impressions of the street, and they are visual, acoustic, and olfactory. What is characteristic of Bar-Ilan, and this poem, Deriba Street at Night in particular, is that urban technology as well as architecture are all framed in metaphors of animals or the human body. So he makes the city and its technical equipment look animated. And this we can see in this small quote here. И автомобили, как коты с придавленными хвостами, неистово визжат «Ах, мяу-мяу». И краснорыжие трамваи, погромыхивая мордами и по черепам булыжников, ползут на воздух. The translation is below. This cityscape is only scarcely populated with some human beings, pimps and smoking women, but they remain absolutely faceless. And also the poem does not explicitly represent a speaking subject. We have no subject that perceives, but the entire poem is built out of these personifications, and they are arranged as a series of pleonastic paratactic constructions. And I think that these impressions taken together replace the perceiving walking subject of the flaneur. And as an effect, we have a significant shift from the moving individual to the seemingly breathing and active subject, the street. So the street becomes the subject. It is the incarnation of vitality itself. What we can see in the poem is a certain moral laxity or shamelessness and also colorfulness. And this is still very similar to what Kohl described back in 1814. But what is very striking is that Balakirsky takes an ironic stance toward authorship and individual expression. And this becomes clear in the closing lines of the poem, where he says, "Rejoice, you pimps, lift up those pipes, you houses, Deribas Street has a poetess too." So he directs the attention to the poetess, the pseudonymous Vera Nina Voskresenskaya. So we wonder who this poetess might be. The female name of her sounds very noble and very Christian. It means the resurrected. And this causes a certain tension with the risque subject of the poem Deribas Street at Night. So implicitly, by means of claimed authorship, this frivolous experience of dangerous nightly cityscape is ascribed to a Christian woman from the upper class. By using this pseudonym, Balakirsky questions the connection between female gender, victimhood, and Jewishness, and all this in public space that was an established topos in the turn of the century press. Balakirsky's irony, however, is also directed on gender and ethnicity in the city's literary scheme. The literary life of the period was absolutely dominated by men, many of them with an assimilated Jewish background. Just before the poem was written, the juxtaposition of this Deribas Street at night and day served in the local press to symbolize the pleasures and also the dangers of modernity. The ambiguities of publicly performed roles and also their attribution to social classes increasingly unsettled the local journalists. Balakirsky, he was well known to his peers as a destitute young man. He plays with these perceptions, writing about Odessa's indecent street life and using a Russian female pseudonym, Nina Voskresenskaya. And he plays with it by using a name of a person that everybody would know would avoid being seen or going out onto Deribas Street at night. This can also be interpreted as a subversive take on common concepts of subjectivity in public space. So he lends his expressive poetic voice to a female subject, but then he turns the moralistic public discourse that is evoked by the name upside down and praises all that is considered dangerous for women. And he, in doing that, dissolves the promenading subject into a dynamic and self-expressive cityscape. In general, Odessa became a very popular literary image and the subject in avant-garde poetry. The next poet that I will be talking about is Yuri Alyosha, who in 1917 published a jocular text called Новейшее путешествие Евгения Онегина по Одессе. And he in this text, he alludes obviously to Pushkin's famous novel, Yevgeny Onegin. And he, again, in this text, addresses Odessa's bustling multi-ethnic public space, again, through a speaker subject who has to be read against the backdrop of Yevgeny Onegin. Oops. So he uses the Onegin stanza and also in playing on motifs from Pushkin, he enacts the city stroll of Pushkin's hero from the beach up to the city center of Odessa. And the speaker contrasts Pushkin's times with the present post-revolutionary period, and also with memories of pre-war times. So we have several time layers interacting. Alyosha employs many of the motifs that by his time had come to determine Odessa's literary image, including prostitutes, criminals, parks, and nudity, also Pushkin's beach, the local food, coffee houses, and the opera house. The cosmopolitan attitude of the narrator found in the Pushkin fragments is retained. And what is important is that the speaker in Alyosha's text also turns his back on the critical reflection about subjectivity. So this is not an important topic for him. The speaker is a common man, and he is confronted to a city in economic crisis, and he is mainly concerned with the impoverishment of the middle class, and they mourn the loss of the pre-revolutionary splendidness. He, like a flaneur, he observes his fellow citizens on the stage of the public street, and this observation takes broad space in the text itself, and he comments on that, but he also is engaged in the language of Odessa, and towards the end of the text, the language and its sounds and its certain notions becomes more and more important. Here I have one little quotation. Ach, одессити все готовы, наловила слова менять, не спекулянт, а спекулятор, не симулянт, а симулятор. So he goes on with these jokes about Odessan language, and he really involves into a consideration of this multilingual, multi-ethnic environment taken as an acoustic impression. He gets even caught in this reflection about local Odessan language with all these grammatical peculiarities and these foreign words from Yiddish and Ukrainian and so on. And towards the end, the main effect of the jocular Onegin version of Alyosha becomes the friction between the funny language that he uses and the many allusions to Pushkin and also the use of the Pushkin stanza. So when we compare Balakirsky's and Alyosha's texts from the 1910s, it becomes clear that both refrain from socio-political or philosophical reflection about the subject. So this is not their main concern. Most importantly, for both, modernity is not connected with a futurist utopia and also not with the individual's estrangement. I think I can show that this changed once they moved away from Odessa. We can see this in Alyosha's later texts in his famous posthumously published Nidnya Bistrochki, Not a Day Without a Line, in which he reflects on his youth in Odessa, and he describes the city as outside space mostly, and many parts of the text are dedicated to the description of strolls through cityscape, in which the Deribas Street is the epicenter of sorts. And I think we can now turn to a small quotation from Nidnya Bistrochki, where he describes his way of perceiving Moscow through the lens of Odessa. This doesn't work. I cannot switch screens. It doesn't matter. I will just read it to you. What have I seen in my life? I'll begin with what I've just seen. Over the asphalted path on which I walked around the Kremlin wall, or more precisely, across the path quickly moved a sparrow. It was alone on the asphalt, in the middle of a big splash of light that was only slightly overshadowed by a single fallen leaf. This is what I have just seen. Much earlier, I have seen a dying gangster who was lying, breathing with his entire breast, his arms thrown apart, lethally wounded. That was on Deribas Street when I was 18 years old. I do not want the reader to look for some kind of contrived analogy. Semantic echoes. When they appear themselves, that's fine. That's their business. But as to conscious wishes, I am far from wanting to do any sort of obvious philosophizing, beginning with a sparrow and jumping over to a gangster. Close quote. So I think that you can see here that here city space and the perception of it becomes something that is closely related to the subjectivity of the writer. And in Aleichen's late memoiristic prose, Odessa becomes some kind of an archaic, archetypical, mythical land that is completely un-Soviet. So here I see the echo to Kohl's claim that Odessa is somewhat un-Russian. For Aleichem, Odessa and the culture in the city is his youth and his un-Soviet past that is completely unconnected to what he goes and lives through in Moscow. And this leads me to just a couple of conclusive remarks. I think on Odessa modernism, we have, compared to other city texts that I know of, a much smaller degree of the subjectivity issue. This is underscored by the text that in Odessa city literature, we do not have as often as elsewhere the motif of the urban subject living in spatial confinement. And this topic of space, living in a small apartment and looking outside, and the perception of space in a small apartment, this is something that, as Wiedler, for example, has shown, is absolutely crucial for Western and in particular German thought about urban and modern living conditions. In Odessa, this is largely absent. We observe significantly deeper engagement with society and also a concern with multi-ethnicity. And I hope I could show you that this perception of a multi-ethnic urban space is very often connected to acoustic impressions, that multi-ethnicity in Odessan literature is something that is often heard. Thank you.
Many thanks to Mirja Lecke. I will take two questions, please. Yes, Sveta, please.
Thank you very much, Mirja. And I would love you to elaborate on the role of balconies, which appears in your first citation, and it reappears specifically with very Odessan site, which is in between. With this thinking about it between, I was thinking as well about eternal problem of dust in Odessa when the steppe enters the city and you cannot block the city. So there is some liminality in its very physical structure. So I would love you to elaborate on this topic.
Yeah, we have been talking about the balconies before. In the modernist literature, balconies do not appear, rather in the texts that are slightly older. Kohl writes about them very much so, and he really reflects on the stage nature of the balcony. This is where people go out and show themselves. But the steppe and the liminality is something that I see rather in Pushkin. It is very present, of course, but the most modernist writers do not go into that so much, I think. But yeah, it's certainly an important question. Thanks, Sveta.
All right. One more question? If there are no more questions, so we proceed to the next speaker. And our next speaker is Ziva Shamir. She is Professor Emerita from the Department of Hebrew Literature at Tel-Aviv University. She is currently teaching Hebrew literature in the Interdisciplinary Center Herzliya. Professor Shamir, formerly the chairperson of the Rosenberg School of Jewish Studies at Tel-Aviv University, has published up till now 39 books. Her topic today is Odessa, the most significant Hebrew center in the second millennium. Ziva.
Good afternoon. I hope you can hear me because the sound in my personal computer is not too good. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this symposium. I am a complete stranger here, but due to the kind cooperation of Roman and Efraim, I was given the opportunity to add something to your topic from the point of view of the ever-growing Bialik research. Of course, during the years, I read all of Bialik's writings, including the letters, the unpublished drafts. Odessa is frequently mentioned in these manuscripts, it only occurred to me recently that this center, under the leadership of Ahad Ha'am, was in fact the most significant Hebrew center in our history, at least in the 1,000 years that elapsed from the Hebrew Golden Age in medieval Spain to our postmodern times. Unfortunately, I doubt there will ever be another possibility to create a similar center again in the foreseeable future. I will try to explain why this fact escaped my attention, as well as the eyes of other researchers who have compiled the fact about East European Jewish life, but their camera did not use wide-angle lenses to capture the entire scene. Perhaps some may consider the title of my lecture as an overstatement and would argue that after the big waves of Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe, first to Palestine and America and then to the State of Israel, it is Tel Aviv and Jerusalem that deserve this crown. Nevertheless, I firmly believe that Odessa is even more significant and has a more meaningful Bill of Rights. It has laid the foundations to our new culture and education. It was the birthplace of the first widespread Hebrew and Jewish newspapers and periodicals. Hebrew literature created in Odessa at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, has never been surpassed in quality, in complexity, and in depth by later literary works up till now. There is no equivalent to Bialik in the history of Hebrew poetry. There is no equivalent to Ahad Ha'am in the field of the Hebrew essay writing, and no equivalent to Sholom Aleichem in the field of Jewish humor. The cultural center of Odessa, with the aid of only 4 or 5 generals, so to speak, and a regiment of, let's say, 40 or 50 simple soldiers, have created some of the most revolutionary changes in the history of Jewish and Hebrew culture. At this point, I will give only one example, which may illustrate the exceptional role of Odessa, of the Odessa Circle, in the in the history of modern Hebrew culture. When I say modern, in this case, like in the title Modern Hebrew Literature, Sifrut Ivrit Chadasha, I refer to the 10 generations, more or less, which passed from the French Revolution to our days, including all period of the Enlightenment. I have recently finished the writing of a book, which will be published next year, dealing with the role of Bialik in the revival of the Hebrew language. I was surprised to find that the central role of Odessa in this renaissance has almost escaped the attention of researchers, and that the common historical descriptions of this revival are based on half-truths and misunderstandings. For instance, it is almost an overused cliche to speak of Eliezer ben Yehuda as the revolutionary leader of the revival, of this revival of the Hebrew language, and to look upon the Hebrew literary circle in Odessa, which gathered around the personality of Ahad Ha'am, as a conservative wing which restrained the rapid cultural changes made by Herzl and his followers, including Ben Yehuda. This well-known but incorrect description was initially based on some real facts, and therefore the picture is so misleading. Indeed, the Odessa Circle had repeatedly pursued the way to slow down the revolutionary steps taken by the Jerusalem Circle of linguists. Indeed, Ben Yehuda was the driving force behind the rebirth of Hebrew as a spoken language in Eretz Israel. Indeed, Ben Yehuda introduced more than 200 new words into the spoken language with the aid of his provocative newspapers. However, it is Bialik who actually deserves the crown of the great innovator, which was put on Ben Yehuda's head for the wrong reasons. It was rather surprising for me to discover that Bialik actually introduced more than 500 new words, more than twice than Ben Yehuda, alongside with many other new phrases which were accepted and are in use until now, whereas most of Ben Yehuda's new words have been rejected by the public, and nowadays they can be found only in his old and somewhat inefficient dictionary. It surprised me because the Hebrew writers in Odessa incessantly expressed their belief that the process of the revival of Hebrew should take several generations before it is completed. They opposed Ben Yehuda's policy in creating new words and ridiculed his role as a founder of a so-called factory of new words with an assembly line system of ready-made inventions. And yet Bialik's contribution to this revival of the Hebrew language was much greater than that of his rivals. Another example of the role of Hebrew Odessa in creating an up-to-date is in the creation of an up-to-date educational system which has laid down the basis of our elementary and secondary schools at present. In Odessa, these schools were called Cheder Metukan, a reformed cheder, and Yeshiva Gdola, great yeshiva, to encourage conservative parents to send their children to these modern institutions, which included all innovations which are so common and widespread nowadays, such as the establishment of mixed gender classrooms for boys and girls, or the study of the Torah from the second grade, starting with Genesis and not with the book of Leviticus. I have read some of the curricula of these schools, which remain in Bialik's archives, and it was hard to believe that most of our contemporary educational methods and procedures are based on principles which were initially implemented by the Odessa Circle headed by Ahad Ha'am. In fact, it should not surprise you that this Hebrew center in Odessa, which lasted less than 60 years and was anti-revolutionary in nature, eventually achieved the most revolutionary results in the history of Hebrew culture. English drama, for instance, is not bad at all. And yet, in the last 400 years, it did not give birth to a second Shakespeare. There are certain phenomena in the cultural history of a nation which sometimes remain unparalleled and unique forever. And it is still an unresolved enigma. Why are all these facts ignored by historians and researchers of Hebrew culture? In my opinion, it is Ahad Ha'am who was unintentionally responsible for this distortion of the picture. He detested publicity and has never encouraged his colleagues and followers to shed light on their amazing achievements. Conversely, he ridiculed the advertising techniques and public relations strategies waged by Herzl and his followers, including Eliezer ben Yehuda in Jerusalem. Ahad Ha'am was too aloof and even a bit snobbish in nature to promote his achievements and demand the applause of a wide public. Generally speaking, the most important word in Ahad Ha'am's writing was truth, as in his series of articles, Emet Me'eretz Israel, truth from the land of Israel. The most important word in Herzl's writing was legend or dream, as in his famous saying, if you will it, it is no legend, or as he put it in German, wenn ihr wollt, ist es kein Märchen. Bialik most probably felt that he gained enough admiration for his poetic achievements and did not seek further glory. He looked upon the other achievements in the fields of education, linguistics, and Judaic studies as something anyone can do. But in editing the book of legends, Sefer Haggadah, and Hebrew medieval poetry, he may have done more than dozens of academic researchers in our universities at present. However, when a man has abundant talents, is overbrimming with talents, is not seeking fame constantly. Perhaps he could not even realize the impact of his great contribution to the fields of the Hebrew revival and of Jewish studies. Ahad Ha'am, who was suspicious of any revolutionary manifestation and encouraged his followers to take slow steps without trumpets and drums, has lost to Herzl in the campaign for the leadership of the Zionist movement. Consequently, historical discussions tended to overlook the enormous contribution of the Hebrew Odessa in all fields that eventually led to the flowering of Hebrew culture of future generations. At this point, I would like to question two of the commonplace truth or half-truth, which are frequently related to Odessa in contemporary historical discussions. First of all, it is common to look upon Odessa as the counterpart or mirror image of Warsaw, and this is far from being accurate. This is a distorted picture which was deliberately created and spread by Peretz and Frischman, the two undeclared leaders of the Warsaw Hebrew Center. These two authors have never attained any achievement equivalent or even similar to the many achievements of the Odessa Circle, and have never initiated any impressive collective projects. They had some followers, but Warsaw cannot be compared to Odessa, neither in importance nor in influence. Due to the relatively favorable conditions for Hebrew culture in Poland in the early decades of the 20th century, it was customary to describe Odessa as a conservative, secluded Bet Midrash with the severity and seriousness and gravity of the old generations. But this was far from reflecting the true reality. Odessa was not only obeying the conservative rules of Achad Ha'am, it was a place where the satires of Linetsky and Mendele Moicher Sforim were thriving. It was the place where Sholom Aleichem wrote his Menachem Mendel's series, and where Alter Druyanov compiled and edited his well-known anthology of Jewish jokes. Bialik satirized this faked dichotomy of Odessa and Warsaw, which was invented by Frischman in his feuilleton Literature and Politics. Indeed, Warsaw became, after World War I, an important center for Jewish literature, but never was an important Hebrew center that could compete in any sense with the excellence of Odessa. This incorrect image of Odessa as a severe and serious center stood, of course, in complete opposition to the nature of the city as a new port city with its many cafes and entertainment houses. One has only to read the descriptions of Odessa in Jabotinsky's diary and in his novels in order to get a different impression altogether. This is, of course, true only until the Soviet regime has set its rules. However, in order to get a deep insight into the phenomenon of Odessa as a Jewish and Hebrew center, one can do this with the aid of 3 poems, 1 short story, and many letters composed by Bialik. As to his poetry, I refer to his poem On the Cape of This Dead Sea, which is an allegorical description of the decline of Odessa, and to 2 other poems written after witnessing the battleship Potemkin burning in the port of Odessa. His short poem, The Summer is Dying, and his long poem in prose, The Scroll of Fire, both depicting the end of his beloved Odessa, in which he settled in order to take part in an active Hebrew center unparalleled in greatness. His satirical short story, Merchant, Sicher, depicts a provincial young married man who leaves his family and comes from far away to join the famous literary circle of Odessa. Sometimes 8 words, like the description of the white storks heading eastwards in his poem, The Summer is Dying, can hold more interesting information than a long diary or novel. These words are repeated in one of his letters to his colleagues, describing the small ships which were leaving the port of Odessa towards Eretz Israel. And one of them took his colleague and partner, Simcha Gutman Ben Zion, and his family to Jaffa after the pogroms of 1905. Bialik, as I said, came to Odessa in order to join the active Hebrew Center, which has emerged before his arrival, but which crystallized and consolidated after he came, especially during the first 5 years of the 20th century. Odessa was a center where Hebrew writers were colleagues who collaborated in the schools and printing houses and publishing houses established by Ahad Ha'am. When one of them urgently needed time to complete his poem or story, his friends would take over his class and teach instead of their colleague. The atmosphere was like that of Elizabethan London, where playwrights such as Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Kidd could cooperate in writing a new play from today to tomorrow, when a new play was needed without further delay. Bialik even purchased and managed a printing house, intending to spend his entire life in Odessa. However, Cleo, the muse of history, had other plans. During World War I and the Russian Revolution, it became clear that Hebrew culture had no chance to survive under the Soviet regime. The Hebrew center of Odessa, which was gradually falling apart after the unsuccessful and bloody revolution of 1905, came to its end. The narrative of the end of Odessa is like in a legend or a fairy tale. Modern Hebrew culture made its first steps in the northern west port of Amsterdam, which was known for its openness and tolerance. From Amsterdam, it moved eastward first to Königsberg, and from Königsberg to Berlin and to Vienna, and from Vienna to Vilnius, and from Vilnius to Odessa. It finally left Europe from an eastern port in the southern parts of Russia, which has just become the Soviet Union. Bialik and his friends from Odessa, among them Meir Dizengoff, who was nominated mayor of Tel Aviv, wanted to restore the atmosphere of Odessa, but in vain. This is not something you can do with political mandates, but rather by the free will of the people involved. And indeed, how many Ahad Ha'ams and Bialiks existed during the many generations of our cultural history. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ziva. It was a really great presentation. Now, some questions, guys? Yeah, Mirja.
You have to raise your voice because I can. You have to raise your voice because I can hardly hear you.
Thank you very much, Ziva. I want to use the opportunity to ask you, as a Bialik specialist, whether you can say a couple of words about how he paints Odessa in these works that you mentioned. I'm so intrigued by the imaginary and the topoi that writers used to describe Odessa. So I was wondering whether you can say some words about Bialik's Odessa. What does it look like?
About his what?
Odessa, the city of Odessa.
I'll tell you, when I see the stairs, the famous staircase of Odessa behind Efraim, I can imagine that the staircase leading from the old municipality of Tel Aviv near the house of Bialik is just a small miniature, how shall I say, model of this famous staircase, which appears in the film on the ship, warship Potemkin. Mm-hmm. Indeed, Bialik wanted, and his colleagues, they wanted to revive the atmosphere of Odessa when they came to Tel Aviv, and by dividing this complex cultural role of Odessa between two cities, In 1925, the Hebrew University was launched in Jerusalem in accordance to the dream of Achad Ha'am to create a spiritual center. This was his famous saying that we need a spiritual center, and simultaneously Tel Aviv played the role of the center of popular culture and entertainment, theaters, movie houses, exhibitions, conference halls, etc. All the places that Bialik described in his many unpublished letters. Odessa, neither of these two centers, not Jerusalem and not Tel Aviv, can equal Odessa in creating a complete complex system of Hebrew culture for all ages and for all strata of the population. This was a unique phenomenon that cannot be restored. And when you have the chance to read the three poems that I mentioned, the short story Merchant and his 5 books of letters, I believe you can get a wide picture of Odessa as seen through the eyes of Bialik.
Thank you.
One more question. Svetlana?
Thank you very much. We just work in our research group. We worked on the poem Haya Erev Katz, and Mirja recognized there are some tropes characteristic of Odessa, and we wanted to see whether you see there maybe representation of Odessa.
Yes, I agree with you. This small poem may depict the parks in Odessa. The word pardes in the language of that days means park. And there were, I can understand there were many parks in Odessa. And also his small folk song, not lo bayom velo balayla, not in daytime, nor at night. I think it also depicts the light side of Odessa, which was not so typical of other centers in Russia.
Thank you very much. And maybe some other small, I don't know, thinking, maybe the role of Bialik, I agree with you completely that Bialik and Mendele are so important for Hebrew language, and it's unproportionally to Ben Yehuda. And when I speak to students about what Mendele and Odessa Circle did, and they always say, but Ben Yehuda was not in Odessa, like, why do you speak about it all? But I thought maybe we can consider one of the reasons of rejection of Bialik from the role from his important role in the dispute with Usishkin regarding the Sephardi versus Ashkenazi pronunciation.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps they couldn't forgive him for the people in Eretz Israel who worked on implementation of Hebrew in the schools. They couldn't forgive him for sticking to the idea of Ashkenazi pronunciation.
I agree with you. I hope the contents of this symposium will be published one day, and then we can offer a wider angle of this topic and add more and more.
All right, yeah. Thank you. And now we're proceeding to our last but not least presenter today. And this is Elena Promyslansky. She's a PhD student at Bar-Ilan University. She's a researcher of Hebrew and Russian literature of 1990s Aliyah from the former Soviet Union. In her research, she's focusing on the symbols of the past and the present. And the topic of her is the promised land of Odessa, the city between myth and reality. Elena, your microphone, please.
Okay.
No.
Thank you. One minute. You can see.
Yes.
It's okay.
It's okay.
Okay. In the present lecture, I will relate to the image of Odessa in the literature of the 1990s emigration from the former Soviet Union. I will focus on the work of two writers who belong to this wave of immigration, Yaakov Schechter and Victoria Reutemann. Both were born in Odessa at different times. Schechter mid-1950s, Reutemann mid-70s, and both have deeply absorbed the spirit of the city. They engage in a dialogue that simultaneously both reflective nostalgia and a process of formulating new identities. The discussion will focus on two novels of these authors. "Вокруг меня был никто," Around Myself Was No One by Yaakov Schechter, which was written in 2004, and Yorve from Osedo, in the reverse reading, Yevri iz Odessa, by Victoria Reutemann, which was published in 2019, and examines the way of portraying the city of Odessa and of creating the city's unique one-time image in the past, in the present. Before the specific discussion of the selected works, it is important to know that space description play an important role in literature in general and in immigration literature in particular. The space is not merely an infrastructure for the occurrence, but it carries symbolic and conceptual meaning from folklore, myth, and special cultural semantics. The researcher Vladimir Toporov has defined the concept of local text, which is a description of the city that as backdrop of occurrence. It represents a concrete reality, but which nevertheless transforms the reality and creates new meanings. Pierre Nora defines the local text as a memorial text, meaning a unique and subjective story that creates the one-time character of the place. This text includes information of
Why the communication is not.
Of, excuse me,
Elena, the communication is not so good. The internet is a little weak.
1 minute. 1 minute, please.
There are disruptions and we can hardly hear.
Yes, 1 minute. טוב, תאשר אותי בבקשה לכניסה.
אוקיי. Тебя и тут, и там передают.
רגע. רגע. אתה תוכל בבקשה לעשות את ה-share screen של המצגת שלי?
כן, כן. תכף. אצלי זה בצורת PDF בסדר.
כן, זה לא משנה.
זה בסדר?
בטח.
טוב. אז
כי
שנייה.
פה זה לא... משום פה זה לא...
אוקיי. כולם רואים את המצגת?
הנה, גם אני הצלחתי לעלות.
אז מה? שאני אצא מה...
שנייה, אני בודקת שזה באמת עלה. לא, אני מעדיפה שאתה תשאיר את המצגת, אם זה אפשרי, כי אני לא...
טוב, אז אני משדר את המצגת. רואים את המצגת?
טוב. יופי. תודה רבה, סליחה. I'm sorry. זה קומביניישן, תעביר בבקשה לשקף 3. Yes, thank you. The combination of both Nora and Toporov ideas defines the city's complex role. It is an active role of expressing the past and the memory, but at the same time serving as a projection of the inner world and building a new picture of reality. Next, I will describe the text of Yaakov Schechter and Victoria Reutemann as a local text related to the city of Odessa. The novel Yorve from Osedo by Victoria Reutemann, תעביר בבקשה. Yes. Describe the journey of a teenage girl, Zoya Prokofiev, from her hometown of Odessa to a youth boarding school on the outskirts of Jerusalem. It is a difficult and faithful journey. Its purpose is to break away from the Soviet past and to form a new identity in the state of Israel. The narrator moves between Odessa and Jerusalem, both physically and in her mind, and she tries to link the two realities. The description of Odessa occupies much space not only as a backdrop for events, but also it is an integral part of the process of formulating the identity in the present time. In this process, Odessa is a piece of the land, a quote of Shaul Chernichovsky's poem, "The man is nothing but the pattern of his native landscape." This piece of the land shapes her personality, perceptions, relationship with the environment, and her choices in life. This special connection to the homeland is explored many times throughout the work and becomes one of the central themes. The favorite place on her childhood town, Odessa, is a statue of the Duke Richelieu. תעביר בבקשה, סליחה. She feels a special closeness to this work of art, which brings her to the point of treating him as a loved one, a kind of spiritual father. She loved to stroll around the impressive statues of the other city symbols, the opera building, the Pushkin statue, all of which relate to the city's unique atmosphere and to the beautiful world of literary figures that are substitutes for human connection in the narrator's life. In this sense, Zoya Prokofiev represents the perception of many Soviet citizens who have created a special cultural world called by the critic Yuri Sloskin Pushkin's religion. Zoya creates an imaginary world connected to the Pushkin's religion, which distances her from reality and places her in the empire of facades. After the Aliyah, תעביר בבקשה. Zoya tries, תודה. Zoya tries to form a new identity, and she tries to bring the Duke, which her to Israel, and Odessa to Jerusalem. But this is not possible. The only sculpture she finds is unclear, some sort of strange combination of a horse and a donkey that only intensifies her strong feelings. In the new reality, that tells her that she has to change her priorities, she must break away from the concept of the past, the Pushkin religion, the facades of the city, and become exposed to people, or in other words, say goodbye to childhood and grow older. And so the narrator's learning at the boarding school becomes a learning process of a human being, of ways of communicating with people. She must understand that life is not a representation of literature and art. Pushkin religions is not a reality, but a complex process of profound coping with and getting to know the world. In the end, the narrator also finds a real statue in Jerusalem, a fountain of the tree of life, which lines around it, reminiscent of the chariot act in Prophet Ezekiel prophecy. The lion symbol of Jerusalem reconnects the myth from the past and the present time and unites all parts on her mind. Duke Richelieu, Pushkin, the Ten Commandments, the prophecy, Odessa, Jerusalem, all of them together create a new picture of reality. תעביר בבקשה. Now I will talk about Yaakov Schechter's novel, «Вокруг меня был никто». It is conclusion about the novel of Victoria Reutemann. One more, please. Thank you. Yaakov Schechter, «Вокруг меня был никто». Yaakov Schechter's novel describes the journey of a psychometrist according to Professor Roman Katsman's interpretation of Kabbalah researcher to Odessa, his hometown. The journey becomes a complex process of self-study, dealing with the legacy of the past and the narrator's experience of understanding his place in the world. The narrator himself presents his novel as a novel of memory and focuses on the narrator's inner world that subjectively describes the surrounding reality. The narrator conducts a complex dialogue with the city based on a number of chronotopes simultaneously. On the one hand, his memories of the past city, and on the other, his confrontation with the modern city of Odessa, which he sees after many years of absence. He rediscovers the beauty of the special city, which was built to the highest European standard, but at the same time, he also feels alien to the city whose entire purpose is to be a statue of beauty. The narrator's ambivalent attitude toward the city is exemplified by two statues of the Duke Richelieu and Pushkin. Pushkin looks at the image of the Duke, while the Duke looks out to the city to the distance. And so the city is an expression of the narrator's inner world in his internal conflict between foreignness and belonging, between connection and alienation. Another level of dialogue with the city of Odessa and himself develops as a result of his contact with people, especially women. Throughout he realizes that people are a true masterpiece, and the central value of the existence as a psychometrist is to explore them rather than objects. Roman Katsman argues that Schechter's novel and its description of relationship with the women indicates the paradigm of victimization as a human cultural phenomenon. Parallel to this plot line, we see the development of another chronotype, a story about a fortress in the city of Rehovot. The narrator presents the heroic story of the fortress and highlights its role in the establishment of the Jewish community in Israel. The story of the fort provides a backdrop for the existence of the master, the great sage, and the founder of the psychometrist cult. You can see that, one more please, yes. That several factors affect the narrator process of formulating his self-image. First of all, the sites of Odessa. The analogy that he creates between his fate and the fate of the national poet Pushkin. The relationship with two women he meets in Odessa. The imaginary night journey to the city of Rehovot, which describes the route of a group of psychometrists and the master's role. All this caused a change in the narrator's perception of the world and himself, regarding his process of dealing, which has a marginal place, and that of the victimization. In conclusion, one more there. In the last one, yes, thank you. In conclusion, in the light of Toporov and Nora's theory, the two novels can be considered as local text. In both novels, Odessa is not only a background for events, but a character we are engaged with in a complex dialogue which stresses the contrast between spaces, eras, worldviews, ideology, myths. All of this is a projection of the inner world of the narrator and an important element in creating a new picture of reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena. It was great. And here we were going to the end. So we'll take two questions about the lecture of Elena, and then I'll present the question of Yohanan, and so we're going to end this meeting. Okay, questions to Elena, please.
One minute, please. Oh.
All right.
I would ask a question.
Okay. Yeah, Mirja.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I was wondering when listening to you whether Odessa is understood in the text that you discussed as something that is typical for the Soviet Union or for Russia. So how is the cultural connotation of Odessa? Is it a past pro toto for some kind of Soviet past? Or is it a place of Jewishness? And this connects to my thesis about Odessa as having the image of being somewhere on the limit in and out of Russia. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Ukraine, of course, also comes into the picture.
Can you speak Hebrew?
No, but Russian, I do understand.
Russia, yes. As мы можем видеть, что Одесса отображает образы и еврейские, и советские, то есть и в какой-то степени израильские после того, как герои возвращаются из Израиля через много лет и вновь видят этот город. То есть Одесса становится воплощением многообразия их личности, многообразия их самоопределения. Если я правильно поняла ваш вопрос.
В частности, меня интересует, как соотносится Одесса и Россия, или Одесса и Советский Союз, или Одесса и Украина, как бы является ли этот город метафорой или метонимией какого-то целостного, другого, иного пространства?
По моему мнению, Одесса является метафорой именно внутреннего пространства. И это то, о чем я говорю. То есть больше в тех произведениях, о которых я говорю, Одесса — это отображение внутреннего мира, отображение памяти, и те конкретные места, которые упоминаются, они больше связаны с внутренним миром, с памятью, с какими-то событиями детства или юности, и намного меньше с конкретными историческими событиями.
Спасибо большое.
טוב, אני יכולה לתרגם לעברית, שלמעשה מתוך העיון ביצירות שהצגתי כאן, נראה שאודסה זה יותר ייצוג של העולם הפנימי של הדמויות, והמקומות הספציפיים, הקונקרטיים שמוצגים פה, הם יותר ייצוג של העולם הפנימי של הדמויות, ופחות ניסיון לשקף איזושהי תקופה סובייטית או פוסט-סובייטית, ויותר את העולם הפנימי של הגיבור.
Thank you. One more
Thank
question.
you.
Alexis, please.
Thank you. Please forgive me, as a historian, I have to ask this question. It's kind of follow-up to the question of Mirja Lecke. If you look at the literature from migrants from the former Soviet Union coming to Israel, are these two texts of Schechter and of Reutemann typical texts? I mean, I have only read Alexander Goldstein's Magnus Opum, and of course there are a lot of places from the former Soviet Union. Old Baku is mentioned, and so on and so forth. So are these two works which you have presented to us now, are there more similar works, or is this kind of handling, speaking about Odessa as a space of memory, is that typical or not typical?
I think
Вы можете на русском можете.
Я думаю об ответе. Мне кажется, что это достаточно типичный случай, когда, то есть отображение каких-то мест из прошлого как точка опоры, чтобы определить какой-то новый взгляд на жизнь, новый взгляд на себя, это точка отчета, точка опоры в понимании нового мира.
Понятно.
То есть это я вижу как общий мотив, который виден в литературе, так сказать, иммигрантов, олим из бывшего Советского Союза. То есть это возвращение для того, чтобы понять настоящее.
Спасибо.
And thank you so much. And thank you to all of you. And now the question of Yohanan Petrovsky-Stern. All right, it's a kind of summarizing question. It's very fitting the end of the meeting now. So here is his question. After Herzliya and Zipperstein's books, scholars became much more interested in compartment questions and secluded strata of Odessa population. Psychoanalytic, Germany-trained doctors, Zionists, Russian-speaking theater goers, grain merchants, 3 dots. Could we find a framework different from the cosmopolitanism to find ways to discuss how these different self-secluding groups interacted across the religious, language, but most importantly, gender and class boundaries? All right. Someone to address this question?
I think that first of all, our research group is perhaps, I think, one of the first to take up the whole question of Odessa cosmopolitanism beyond the foundation work of Patricia Helly, who did a lot to investigate the grain trade and Odessa's 19th century history, and beyond Zipperstein's seminal history of Odessa Jewry, which only goes up to 1880. So I think we are treading on new ground. Is cosmopolitanism the best term for what we are investigating? I think that remains to be seen, as we haven't finished our research. But I think even during our discussions today and in our discussions in our seminars, we've looked at different ways in which cosmopolitanism, or rather cosmopolitanisms in the plural, need to be interrogated, challenged. And I think discussion today about class, about liminality, about language, about elitism of the Odessa Circle. These are all ways of interrogating this term, which I think really does need to be interrogated. Is there a better term? I don't have an answer for that. Maybe someone else can suggest something.
All right.
I think maybe, I think maybe, and here I follow Zipperstein, who, when he spoke about significance or otherness of Odessa, he spoke about place where practice was always before ideology. You were in specific circumstances and you acted. Only thereafter you started to understand what the meaning of your acts. And some people even didn't conceptualize even retroactively. And I think in Odessa context especially, question of practice and of contingency and circumstances is very important. And in a way, this is the ground of encounter of different perspective, because all protagonists of ours, first of all, had to act in certain circumstances, and only then bigger constructs emerged, I think.
In this case, the cosmopolitanism is the ideology or practice. This is a question, I think. If you say that our concept, that your concept, and it's not mine, but your concept is the everyday life practices, so why this complexity of everyday life in Odessa should be named cosmopolitanism, or at which stage of the research this may be called in this or another ideological term? Yeah, Mirja?
May I say? I think it really depends on what notion of cosmopolitanism you use. I mean, cosmopolitanism is first and foremost, of course, a word that was used in the ideological struggles of the time. So we have one use there. But then again, we also have very different approaches through entire the history of ideas of cosmopolitanism, of course, very different aspects focused in the notion of cosmopolitanism. And I think especially in the newer texts about cosmopolitanism, where the concrete spatial practices are foregrounded, we can find something that will help us look critically at the concept the way it was used in the late 19th and early 20th century, but also tools to understand ethnic interaction in concrete local spatial practices. And this is something that I'm interested in. And first of all, for that, we need to know about the connotations, the mind maps that were used in the different communities. I mean, most research is, of course, based on national narratives. And I think today in Ziva's talk, we heard perfectly well how nationalized narratives have certain ways of functioning. And if we try to look for something as concrete and spatially confined as Odessa in all these narratives that are traditionally told in the different national communities, we may find some concrete forms and smaller scale findings that help us understand how people thought about multi-ethnic coexistence and how this was translated into various cultures. And this is what interests me in the notion of cosmopolitanism. This is nothing that I would say is great in any way, and I want to find it in Odessa. It is rather a critical tool for me to access the material that exists in various cultures.
All right. Yeah, Alex?
Thank you. I think it would, of course, be very important to hear Johannan's answer or Johannan's reaction to our suggestions. But I think it's good to ask this very fundamental questions. So to ask about our own concepts and ideologies and mind maps. And I think what comes to my mind as an alternative, if not always competing concept to cosmopolitanism, might be also this concept of imperial city or imperial situation in this particular times, end of Tsarist empire, beginning of Soviet times, also new Soviet empire. So I think to follow up what Mirja said about spatial practices and ethnic interaction, if you add the imperial question, then you come very fast to this concept of hierarchy. So all these practices, if we are interested in practices and the functioning of ethnic mind maps in different communities, so I think it's probably already done, but it's the first results of this research is that of course there are hierarchies in the organization of a city like that, and in the organization of practices like that, and all-day practices. And I think the word hierarchy is kind of not compatible, could not be brought in harmony with the idea of cosmopolitanism. I just end with that question.
Okay. Some more replics?
Perhaps just,
right.
I mean, it depends on what notion of cosmopolitanism you apply.
Yeah, exactly.
So, there are types of cosmopolitan thought that do include hierarchies. But this is to be continued, probably not today.
Yeah.
All right, you have a great group to work and a great subject to work on. So I think that we can conclude our meeting at this point. And thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. It was great to see you all, to meet you.
Thank you.
All right. So now we'll stop recording, and it will be uploaded to that or another site. So I think that Efraim and me will let you know where it is placed, so you could send to your friends. And good luck with your great and very, very interesting project. Thank you for your
Thank you, Roman, for all your hard work. And
תודה רבה.
thank you. And I hope we will continue the conversation.
All right, of course.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care of